There are some sermons that are pretty hard to put together as a pastor. I don't know if it's because of the topic that they're on or because maybe the commentaries just don't enlighten the passage or don't go in the direction that I like. And even though I ask the Holy Spirit, how do I present this passage or how do I get this, it just didn't happen without much struggle or much contemplation. But there are other times when sermons just flow out. I mean, they're as if I'm a gusher and I just want to get that message out because it's just bubbling up inside me so much. It's given me such a great hope. Maybe it's a topic or the scriptures. It's just wonderful to present. Maybe it's something that happened that week that just kind of lined up, or there's an illustration or an introduction that just kind of, oh yes, that's how I can present this. And it's very fun to put together. This morning's sermon is one of the later. It's very fun putting this together. In fact, I've been preaching this sermon in my head for at least 6 months. At least 6 months. Probably longer than that. I mean, I've been thinking about this sermon and thinking about how I'm going to preach this sermon for this Sunday. I was looking forward to this Sunday because I knew that I wasn't going to preach next Sunday. But when I found out that this church was going to celebrate 125 years, I had to figure out why. Right? There's one question that's been on my mind even over the last several years, not just, ever since I've moved here to Groveland, I've been asking this question to myself. And it's a question that you may have asked yourself at times. You see, we've been preaching in a series about what's in a name. And all these sermons that I've been preaching so far have been lining up to this time of our celebration. It's a theme that we talk about with the names of God and of Jesus and how they give us insight from the Bible. It helps us understand who we are in Christ as Christians, as missionaries, as people through Christ. And it's central to what this church is and to why we exist. Because a church doesn't last 125 years without a reason. That doesn't happen by accident. I mean, I've heard of many churches down through the years who have closed their doors, who have disbanded, who have moved on, and they didn't even last half that amount of time. What makes this church, what makes Groveland Missionary Church different than so many other churches that we see around us? What is it about this church that brought us through the highs and the lows over these last 125 years? What is it about this town, this church, this community that allowed us to continue to reach out, to continue to grow, to continue to share the love of Jesus to those around us? Why did this church begin? Why did Joseph Ramsire 127 years ago come to Groveland, of all towns that he could go to? Why did he come to Groveland and preach a revival service, a tent services just a couple miles south of here? Why did he come back the next summer and do the same thing? And why did 41 members of the church start this body and start the Groveland Missionary Church? And this is the question we're going to look at this morning. A question that many of us asked down through the years. Why Groveland? What is it about this place that 125 years ago, people gathered and became a church? Why did it start here? What is it about this area that not only started this church, but has allowed it to continue to grow and prosper for more than 125 years later? That was a question I tried to figure out this last year. And I did a lot of research. Our church has a very extensive archival place. I did research that I could answer this question this morning. I went to libraries, different libraries around the area, different historical societies. I've read books. I looked online. I found all kinds of historical documents and pictures. I did interviews and even asked some of our older members of the church this question: why Groveland? I looked at genealogies and biographies and obituaries and all these to answer this one question: why Groveland? Why? And I found the answer. And I was a bit surprised when I found the answer. I found the answer, though, and I'm going to tell you it to you this morning. I know without a shadow of a doubt the one reason why this church was founded 200 or 125 years ago. I whittled it down from all the possibilities. I came to the conclusion about the answers to this one question: why Groveland? And as you see, this answer is one that I think will help spur us on for the next 125 years of existence of this church. So let me share with you some of the things that I found looking back at the history of the Groveland Missionary Church and let you know the answer to the question, why Groveland? Well, there are many reasons why churches are planted to begin with, why churches start, right? And probably the number one reason why churches are started is because of the population, right? That's your first P in your outline, population. Usually the most common reason is that there's a place that has a large number of people, right? A large population. You need to have people, a lot of individuals living in the area in order to build a church. Because if you build a church in the middle of a country field or in the middle of a farm field, you're not going to get many people there, right? So you need to have a large population. And so I went back in the history books and looked about Groveland. Now, today, if you look around Groveland, there's not a whole lot of people living in the town of Groveland. I mean, there are a little more than about 19,443 people. 1,900, I should say. 1,900 people. Less than 2,000 people. In this one blinking light, we don't even have a real stoplight in this town. One blinking light, one gas station, one bar. Every town needs a bar, I guess. And one restaurant, well, 2 restaurants I know, plus a few other local businesses. There are other towns nearby that are much bigger, right? If you look at the population there of Peoria, it's around 113,000. Pekin is 31,000. Morton is 17,000 or so. There's a lot of people around, and this small town of 2,000 doesn't seem like there's a lot of people in it to draw from for a church. So I thought, well, maybe if you look back 125 years from now, maybe the town had a larger population. Maybe that was the draw, that Groveland was kind of the population capital, and then these other cities started growing and people moved into those cities. And so I looked at history books. And you know what? I could not find Groveland itself. The closest I could find is the Groveland Township. The whole township, which includes a lot of area around here, about 2 miles square here around here. The whole township back in 1900 was 1,600. Okay, 1,600. That's the entire township. Probably less than 1,000 probably in the town here of Groveland back in the 1900s. And I thought, okay, well, maybe the other cities were not taken off yet, but Peoria, back in the 1900s, was 56,000. Pekin was 8,000. Morton was actually a lot less, about 900, okay? Morton just boomed, I guess, in the last 125 years. But Groveland wasn't very big, wasn't much bigger than Morton, okay? So not much has changed in the last 125 years. We're still a small community surrounded by much larger towns and cities around us. It does not seem like Groveland ever was a big metropolitan city back in the day when the church planters would love to stick their foot into and say, hey, we need to get our foot into the city, and so therefore we have lots of people to draw from, and therefore our church would be large and big and whatnot. It just wasn't there in Groveland. Never has been. It does not seem like that answers our question to the idea, why Groveland? It wasn't the population. So I thought maybe there was some attraction so I would draw people to bring people to Groveland. Maybe Groveland was a travel hub in the 1900s, okay? Right? Late 1800s. Then it hit me, the train. So maybe it's the popularity of Groveland that drew people. Maybe this train that came by the church here was the big draw. I mean, I've heard that the train station was just a little bit north of here, a couple blocks, back behind what's currently Woody's. Maybe that was kind of a draw that people, needed to travel to Groveland, and then from Groveland they disperse. I've seen pictures. We got a picture here of our church from the area view here, the old chapel there, the 1950s or so. You see the track right there north of us. Here's another picture of the church playing ball there in one of the lots out there, and the train going by here. And then I love this one here. It's a little bit more modern, but there's the chapel there and the train going just north of here. That's where the tracks were. In fact, I heard that even sometimes during a Sunday morning sermon, the train would go by about 10:30 and they'd have to stop everything. And okay, the train's gone. Let's go ahead and continue singing. I've heard that. Maybe this was the idea. That maybe this is why the church was planted here, because the train station was great. And I looked and I did some research on the Peoria Eastern Rail Company that owned the tracks to see if this was a key destination. And I found a shocking answer. No, it was not. It was not a train draw. I mean, the train came from Peoria and came from Morton and came from Pekin and came from even Delavan. And they were all linked together, and it was just another stop along the route. It wasn't anything special here in Groveland that would say, oh, we need to build a church here because a lot of people are coming to this train station. No, not really. It wasn't that answer. When I asked why Groveland, and I looked at the popularity, the train wasn't it. And I looked around and said, if there's any other popularity things here, no attractions, nothing in the late 1800s that would be a draw. This was not a hub, a dropping off point. And I was even told by others that it wasn't even very expensive to ride the train here and there. I mean, it just was just commonplace every day. I mean, you didn't need to hitch up your horse back then, but you could just drive the train. It disappointed me. That wasn't the answer either. So if it wasn't population or the popularity of Groveland, maybe this town was a good place to plant a church because someone famous lived here. Maybe there's a famous actor or president or someone that lived here that, hey, this is so-and-so's hometown and we need to come here because so-and-so is very famous and they're going to... So I looked. I looked in the history books. I looked all over the place. And you know what? I found, is there popularity? Is there fame to this town? And I found that the answer was yes. I found an answer. I found it. I found that there was a famous celebrity that had his hometown here in Groveland. His name was Harlan Turnbell. Or Tarbell. Harlan Tarbell. Excuse me. Harlan Tarbell lived here in Groveland. Can you believe it? Do you know who Harlan Tarbell? Anyone know who Harlan Tarbell is? You know who Harlan Tarbell is? No. I know who Harlan Tarbell is. He is actually a pretty famous person, actually, in some circles. In some circles. I knew long before I read this name here when I said, I know this guy. He is a famous guy. And he had his hometown here in Groveland for the first 17 years, or he wasn't born here, he was born a little south of here, but about 17 years of his life he lived here in Groveland. And I heard of him. I knew him. He's a very famous person who wrote a book that's in quite widely use throughout the nation in one particular group of people. And he's since passed away. And I even tried to email his relatives to see if they could give me some insight on his life here in Groveland, see if he actually went to our church. I'm not sure if he did or not. Not sure even if his spirituality or whatnot. But I was stunned that this man lived in Groveland for a number of years. Imagine Harlan Tarbell in our community. Now, for those of you, most of you, who don't know, Harlan Tarbell wrote the renowned, quintessential, and definitive encyclopedia of magic. If you're a magician, you know Tarbell's name. I mean, this book, this encyclopedia set, 8 volumes, is everything you want to know about magic. Performing it, some tricks, all kinds of... If it's about magic, it's in these books. Honestly, it is. These books sell for hundreds of dollars. I went to a used bookstore about a month ago with my brother, found 5 of them, $125 used for 5 of these 8 volumes. If you ask any magician, David Copperfield, David Blaine, Lance Burton, any magician, and you say, Harlan Tarbell, and they'd say, oh yes, we learned magic from him. Probably all of them to a T would say, we've read his books, we've seen his books, we have his books in our collection. Any magician in the world, Tarbell is very famous in the magical world. And he lived here in Groveland at the turn of the century. However, who cares? Other than this, I found it very fascinating. I like magic, and I don't have his books, but I haven't read any of his books, but I've heard that they are just so great. But Groveland has no other famous person that grew up here. No famous Billy Grahams, no presidents, no famous celebrities, nothing. And so I don't think it was publicity that caused Groveland to be founded. So what was it? If it wasn't his population, if it wasn't the popularity, I mean, this town has always been a small, and always probably will be a small town. There was no popularity that drew people to this town. There's nothing of, as far as attractions or significant hubs of travel. It's an out of the way, off the beaten path type of a town. There's no public celebrities that call Groveland home, at least to the large portion of the population. And so what is it? Why start a church in 1898 in a small town on a common train route in a town whose only claim to fame was a writer who wrote books about magic who wouldn't actually become famous until many, many, many years after this church was founded? Why? Why? And so I looked and I looked and I looked to find out what was the reason. There had to be something. You just don't plant a church and say, oh, let's just have a group of people come together and it doesn't last 125 years. I did read one piece of trivia in history books about the Mennonite church. Some of you may know that our church kind of, I'm not sure if it broke off or kind of came from the Mennonite church, the defenseless Mennonite church. I had a church here in Groveland. In fact, the church down the road here, the Groveland Mission, the Mennonite church, is kind of their child there. But they had a church here in town, and I read about the Mennonites. And there's a famous Mennonite, Joseph Ramsire. Joseph Ramsire, you got a picture here of him. He was a traveling pastor with the defenseless Mennonites. He'd go from town to town and went all the way out to Nebraska, up to Michigan, all over the place. But he was key to founding this church. And in the summer of 1896, he came to Groveland and pitched a tent and had a revival service. Okay, and one book said this about him. It says he was a dramatic personality, a powerful pastor, and a man of apparently deep and sincere convictions. I mean, this guy just had the right words to say in the right times and the right way of saying things. And he preached to primarily farmers. I've read that it's primarily farmers in those times, back in the 1800s, 1890s. He preached to some farmers who farmed during the day, and then after they got done with their farm, would come at nighttime and they had the revival services. And this was part of the defenseless Mennonite church. And I read somewhere that the Mennonite church especially loved to start churches in cities and towns where there was no churches. Okay? They kind of looked at Paul's example in the New Testament. Paul says in Romans chapter 15, verse 20, it's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ is not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. That was kind of their theme verse. Let's go to these small towns. The cities are already won for Christ, essentially. They have churches already. Let's go to small towns that don't have churches and gather some groups. And so the Mennonites would do that. And so that does give us a start. It does give us a point about why Groveland was a small town. Let's start a church here. But again, that doesn't give us the reason why it continued on. I mean, I know many Mennonite churches who've started and stopped. They disbanded, they moved on or whatever. I know many Mennonite churches that have closed. So I started looking, I said, okay, what is it about this church? So I started, let's start with the founding fathers and founding mothers, okay? So there are 41 people that founded it. And I found the answer as I looked to those people. And I found that the answer, why Groveland, it was people. I started looking at the people that founded this church. And here's the whole list of them. I listed them there, and it's the 41 people that started this church. And you see, God knew that it's the people that are on this list that would make a big impact for Christ, make a big impact for His kingdom. God knew that people would come to this church who would not only reach out to people, but those people would reach out to other people, and those people would reach out to other people, and His kingdom would increase. That those 41 starting members would spread and grow God's message literally around the world. No exaggeration, as you'll see in a minute. That those lives that they impacted here at this church impacted lives literally around the world. Now, you've probably seen this list, and I'll probably put it in the bulletin next week. But I started doing some research on them. Many of them were not very impressive. I couldn't find much about them. I just couldn't. I looked online. I looked at obituaries. I even went to the cemeteries nearby. They're not very impressive. They're just faithful men and women who are just doing their daily task. Going about their daily lives, common merchants and farmers with families. And even with all the information on the internet and in our archives, some of them, unfortunately, are lost in time. I could not find any information on them. Some of them I could only find a day of death. I finally found this last week some of the death dates. But up until this last week, about 26 of these 41 members, I couldn't find anything about other than their name that was on a list that I've been in the files for many years. In fact, some of the women on the list, you'll notice on there, if you can read those names, I couldn't find their first names anywhere in the literature that we have around this church. There's only Mrs. and their husband's name and their last name. Mrs. John Smith type of thing. It wasn't Joan or Martha or whatever. I couldn't find their names. So I still on the list here have some of them that are Mrs. Sam Berkey, for instance. I couldn't find the names. But each one of them, I think, touched someone else's lives, whether it be their children or someone else that lived around them. And this small church started out small, which reminds me of a verse that I found this a couple months ago, and I love this verse. I think I put it in your bulletin this morning. I don't know, but it's a verse from Zechariah, chapter 4, verse 10. It says, "Do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin." It says, don't worry about how small the work of God starts. God just wants you to start. He loves to see those things begin. He wants to see those ripples happen. It's kind of like a pond. Have you ever been to a pond, maybe early in the morning, and it's just flat? Nothing shimmering on the water, just a flat pond. What do you want to do when you see a shimmering pond like that? You want to take a big stone and throw it in the middle, right? And you throw it in the middle, and it just splash. It makes a huge splash, and then the splash disappears. But the results of that splash make little ripples that make more ripples, that make more ripples, that make more ripples, right? Long after that splash, that initial rock settles to the bottom, the ripples are still going out. And they eventually reach the shores, and they what? Reflect off the shore, and they ripple back, right? That's what this church is all about. That's what the gospel of Jesus is all about. People touching lives, touching other lives, that touch other lives, that touch other lives. And eventually they'll reach the shore and come on back, because the rock that started in this town, in Groveland, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, like I said before, literally rippled around the world. The effects of the last 125 years are still reverberating outward, and they're starting to reverberate back. Let me give you some examples here. You saw that list up there. I'm going to just pick out some names here. Okay? I picked out Lena Hostetler there. She was one of our founding members. She, I found out, was a widow when the church was founded in 1898. Okay? She had a young daughter named Katie, and she would eventually move away from here and move to Fort Wayne, Indiana. There in Fort Wayne, Indiana, she started becoming a very just common cook. But she started a cook at a college, a small Bible college that started out there in Fort Wayne called the Fort Wayne Bible College. Remember that name. You'll hear it many times this sermon this morning. She became a cook at Fort Wayne Bible College. It was a college that Joseph Ramsire, who was noted here earlier, would help become president of and would help lead for several years. Was part of the missionary church for a number of years. And that college, Fort Wayne Bible College, was the home of several pastors and missionaries and students who became teachers and nurses and businessmen and other careers. Again, who literally went around the world. And Lena Hostetler, was one who served in the background. Someone who did not serve up front, wasn't a big popularity person. She served in the background as a cook who ministered and nourished men and women for Jesus, if not spiritually, at least physically, by serving as food, right? Her testimony from this church helped spread to different people and rippled upon those students who rippled upon other people, who rippled upon people. Lena Hotsettler, small cook, college, from this church. Let me give you another name, John C. Berkey. Now, there are a number of Berkeys on our list here. Actually, there's 3 different spellings, 3 different versions of Berkeys here. But John Berkey was a member of this church. It started the church, and he left this church, and he decided to go out to Nebraska. And he started the Eden Missionary Church in Waneta, Nebraska. Now, who knows where Waneta, Nebraska is? I don't see. You know where Nebraska? Okay, there is someone that knows where Waneta, Nebraska is. It's as far from nowhere as possible, right? It's on the southwest corner of Nebraska. If you see Nebraska with a little shape there, small southwest corner of Nebraska there. Today it only has 48 people in it. Very small town. But you know what? Just about 35 miles from there is another small town called Culbertson. And there was another missionary church there in Culbertson. I'm not sure which one started first. I could not find the information about the Eden Missionary Church because it has since closed. But John Berkey started this church in Waneta, Nebraska, very close to Culbertson, Nebraska. Now, these 2 churches were the only missionary churches within about a 200-mile radius. I mean, they're the only churches there. These 2 churches about 35 miles apart, within 200 miles. I mean, the next missionary church, I think, was in Milford, which is 225 miles away. And so I'm sure these churches kind of bonded together because they were the only ones around, right? And so they had some time together, I'm sure. And the pastors throughout the years probably supported one another. And it was a small town that a young man pastored. And unfortunately, he's not sitting in the sanctuary this morning because he's over pastoring in Pekin this morning. Marvin Clausen pastored Culbertson Missionary Church out there in Culbertson, Nebraska. Out there in Culbertson, Nebraska. Another young man was born to Marvin and Sue, who lived in Culbertson for his first 5 years of his life. That's me. And so this church, in an indirect way from John Berkey, who founded the church out there in Waneta, and Culbertson, had an impact on my life. And it's in a small way. Okay? But hey, I'm kind of a product of here. The one standing before you is, if it wasn't for John Berkey starting his church, I wouldn't have that ripple on my life and on my family. Talk about ripples. But that wasn't the only missionary church that was started because of Groveland Missionary. The one in Eden Missionary Church in Waneta. But there's another church not too far from here in Peoria called the Mount Olive Missionary Church. And another Berkey, S.D. Berkey, I'm not sure what his name was because, again, there's many S names there. But S.D. Berkey from this church started Mount Olive Missionary Church back in 1904. That church is still reaching out today. Still has a fairly good congregation. Has growing and touching many lives up in Peoria. That church gave birth to another church. They call it the Olivet Missionary Church. Now, unfortunately, the Olivet Missionary Church has since closed, but for many years, Olivet Missionary Church, our granddaughter church, essentially, in the spiritual realm, was ministering there in Peoria. Right? Our spiritual descendants from this church was Mount Olive and Olivet. We're not done yet because we also started a church in Pekin, the Pekin Bible Church that's called today. That's the 4th church that developed as a result of those 41 people. Those are churches, not just people rippling on people. Those are churches rippling on churches. Right? Not done yet. Because there was another man, one of the original 41, by the name of M.E. Ramsire, who went to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And he planted another church in 1928. His name, M.E. Ramsire, might sound familiar. He was the brother of Joseph Ramsire. Joseph Ramsire, talked about before, had the picture up there. And Ramsar lived here in Morton, and maybe that might be one reason why Joseph came to Morton and came to Groveland, because he was visiting his brother and his new wife. I guess she just got married there shortly before our church was founded. But he decided he wanted to plant a church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and so he planted the Harvester Avenue Missionary Church. Now, Harvester might sound familiar because Harvester tractors are built very close, or were built very close to where that church was founded. The International Tractor Company, those red tractors you see out in the fields, a lot of those were built in Fort Wayne, Indiana, very close to this church. Blue-collar working, middle of the city type of thing. It's now the inner city type of thing. And so it's been ministering to people over a century now, or almost over a century. I guess it's 28 would be just a few more years from now. But this church in the inner city of Fort Wayne became a well-known church for college students and professors from Fort Wayne Bible College. Again, another ripple there, okay? College students and professors came to Harvester Avenue Missionary Church for many, many years. It had a large ministry, had a radio broadcast at one time. And Harvester Avenue Missionary Church is home to another man who had a very big influence there. And I talked to him just a few weeks ago, Todd Hodbegger. Todd Hodbegger went on from Harvester Avenue Missionary Church and founded a church of his own up in the Chicago area called the Village Church of Gurnee. Another grandchild of this church. Village Church of Gurnee, I'm not sure if you know, it's one of our mega churches here in the Missionary Church District. I mean, they have thousands of people weekly in their services. And it all started with 41 people in this church. Our church gave birth to churches, who gave birth to churches, who gave birth to other churches. And who knows where the ripple effect might stop. This church is also instrumental in the seventh church, a Hispanic church here in Peoria that is still going strong and ministering to the Hispanic community here in Peoria. 7 churches can be traced back to the one church here in Groveland. And I'm not sure, I didn't find this out, but I think even the Village Church of Gurnee actually planted another church too, I think. I don't know. They're large enough they might have. That would be 8 churches. Maybe more. And those are the ones that just could keep track of, okay? Who knows how many lives were saved? Who knows how many Christians were encouraged and built up? Who knows how many people experienced the ripple that started here just a few hundred feet down that hallway. And I know 125 years ago, those 41 people had no idea the impact they would have upon the kingdom of God. They had no idea that 125 years from their time, that we would still be growing strong, and that hundreds and hundreds of people and 8 churches would be planted. All because of a few faithful followers. Hundreds, maybe even thousands and thousands of lives have been touched. The answer to the question, why Groveland? It was the people. Those 41 people. It was the people who God blessed, who reached us, who are sitting here today. We would not be here without them. All because of a few faithful followers. I've already mentioned a few weeks ago how this church has supported and sent missionaries out around the world. Okay, right? I mean, it's people again. Okay, countless missionaries. I wish I could count them. I tried counting them and I lost track about who was who. I mean, Rick Dugan said the same thing a few weeks ago when he was here. People like John Berkey, who was one of our founding fathers, who went to China. Samuel Berkey was another founding father who had a child named Clarence, who went to Africa. Clarence also had a son named Sam Berkey, who became a missionary to Haiti. We talked about Clinton Mosier, who was a former pastor of this church, whose son grew up in our church, Howard Moser, went to Ecuador, and whose grandson, Nathan, is currently ministering in Greece. In fact, Nathan is going to be here 10 days from now on Wednesday, right after our celebration. He's going to be sharing with us a little bit more about his ministry there in Greece. Another Berkey, Merlin Berkey, who was a member until just recently here, had a niece who spent years growing up here named Sally. Sally married a man named Tim Ertle. Tim and Sally went to Jamaica. ministered there in Jamaica. They are currently now at Bethel, working with the students there in Bethel. Tim and Sally Ertl, I believe, are going to be here next week. You can ask them about their time here at Groveland. These are all these people from here were sent out around the world, literally around the world. And there's others who have gone out of this church as pastors, as ministers. Let me give you a more recent example. Many of you know Cindy Schimmelfein, daughter of Dar and Bob over here. She can trace her family back to one of the founding members of this church. She grew up in this church. She became a Christian just a few doors down in those Sunday school rooms. She was part of our thriving youth group at the time. And she's now a children's pastor up in Kankakee, ministering and telling boys and girls about Jesus. In fact, I just talked to her a few weeks ago. She's planning on being here next week as well. I talked to her just a few weeks ago, and she just came from her VBS. Hundreds of kids came to her VBS. And she also said, I just got done with my summer camp, where many, many, many young people came to know Jesus for the first time. From this church. Hearts and lives have been changed. And that's just one of the more recent examples of how this church still impacts lives. Let me give you another example. Name you don't know, but I know very well. Cleo Hatfield. I mentioned Harvester Avenue Missionary Church. Amy Ramsire founded that church. Cleo Hatfield, if not was a founding person of that church, was very early on. I mean, she was very old many years ago, but she was one of those that grew up at Harvester Avenue Missionary Church. She was a longtime member, taught Sunday school for a number of years. She lived right next to the church, had a house right literally across the parking lot, very close like I am now. But she lived right next to the church and she became known as Grandma Hatfield because she loved the children of the church and everyone loved to be her grandmother. She gave birth to a daughter named Bonnie. Bonnie married and she gave birth to a daughter named Sue. Sue went to Harvest Avenue Missionary Church as well. She went from there to Fort Wayne Bible College where she met a man named Marvin. Marvin and Sue married, and they had a child. Me! In case of those like that, yeah. Cleo Hatfield, my great-grandmother, grew up at Harvester Avenue Missionary Church. One of the founding people there at Harvester. This young man sitting before you literally has a spiritual descendant of this church. I'm your great-grandchild. Great, however many great. I am a product of this church. It's scary to think, but I might not exist at all. At all, if it wasn't for this church. My mom and dad might have never met. Without Chloe Hatfield, without Harvest Avenue Missionary Church, without this church. I am living proof that Groveland Missionary Church is still strong. But it was just one life that touched another life. That touched another life that resulted in me. And me being here before you this morning. Preaching a sermon. Talk about a spiritual heritage. Right? I'm here full circle, celebrating and praising God for the people here who rippled upon my life. One more story. Samuel Berkey. I mentioned Samuel Berkey before. He was one of our founders. He had 7 children. One of those children was named Jesse, a man who I'm told literally helped build the church. Literally, he was one of the builders. Built some of these buildings. Jesse had a son who was an invaluable member of this church for a number of years, teaching, serving on church boards, even becoming our treasurer. We just celebrated Norman Berkey's 90th year on earth just a few months ago. Norman Berkey, product of Samuel Berkey. I don't know how many lives were touched because of the work of Jesse and Norman. But Samuel Berkey had another son, named Clarence. I've already mentioned Clarence. He was a missionary. But he had a son named Samuel that was a missionary as well. But Clarence also had another son. Maybe you even know Arlen Berkey. How many of you know Arlen Berkey? Many of you know Arlen Berkey. Yes. Yes. Arlen Berkey took a different path from his father and brother. He didn't become a missionary. He decided to become a professor at a college, a small Christian college in Fort Wayne, Indiana, called Fort Wayne Bible College. Fort Wayne Bible College, like I said before, is a college where my parents went to. It's the same one I mentioned before, and he taught at Fort Wayne Bible College for decades. I don't know how long he taught there exactly, but he impacted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students. Hundreds of students went through his class, hundreds of pastors, missionaries, nurses, people who were influenced under Arlen's teaching. But I want to mention two in particular that I will highlight that learned Greek under Arlen's teaching. One name, you might have heard her name, Christine Matthew. Now, you don't know Christine Matthew now because she married someone else, and that was her maiden name. But Christine Matthew was one of the students in Arlen's class. She married a man named Ken Snyder. Now, Ken Snyder might be a little bit more familiar to you. He's the current district superintendent of this church. Over to all the churches here in Illinois and Indiana. He's a regional director. It's not district superintendent anymore. It's regional director of our churches in this area. Ken and Christine are still ministering to the churches around our area. And I know that Ken Snyder, I believe he's coming next week as well, and Christine maybe as well with him. So ask them about their life via Arlen Berkey. But there's one other student that was in that same class that learned Greek alongside Christine. And his name was Timothy Clausen. Again, another ripple on my life. Arlen Berkey was my Greek teacher at Fort Wayne Bible College, which is now known as Taylor University. My third connection via Culbertson, via Harvester Avenue Missionary Church, Harlan was my teacher. Not Harlan, Arlen. And I grew tremendously under his teaching. In fact, one of the first sermons I wrote was in his class. He wanted us to write a sermon based on the Greek Bible. It was one of the first sermons I wrote, and it was kind of as a contest. You know, the best sermon wins type of thing. And guess whose sermon won first prize? Yeah, my sermon won the first. That gave me the honor of preaching that sermon in front of the entire student body there at Taylor University. One of my first sermons I wrote and delivered was because of Arlen Berkey, who was because of Clarence Berkey, who was because of Samuel Berkey, who was a member of this church 125 years ago today. Isn't God such humor great, right? Who would have thought that a humble beginning of a church in a small town of Groveland, Illinois, would see a spiritual descendant in more ways than one come back and be the pastor here 125 years later? Isn't that great? Isn't that great? Can you see why I led the sermon? Can you see why I wanted to preach about this? I'm going over here and I need to get to my conclusion here. But God has done a lot in this church, okay, in 125 years. And He's still not done, okay? 41 members started, right? How many are in our sanctuary today? About that many, maybe a little less. Can you remember how many those 41 people touched? How many we can touch? If we continue to be faithful to God? If we continue ministering to each other and to others around us? They touched lives, who touched lives, who touched other lives, who are currently touching lives right this very minute. Literally. What kind of ripple are you making for God? God is not done with this church. Like I said a few months ago, when I put together our mailing list for our 125th anniversary, I got our directories for the last 25 years. I could only find the directories for the last 25 years. But I listed all the names, all the individuals that were in our directories just for the last 25 years. That's 1/5 of our amount of time that we've been a church. 1/5. And I came up with over 750 names that were in our directories. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of people who have passed through these doors. And this morning I've just given you a few examples of the disciples who make disciples who make disciples. But this is a sermon, so I need to put some scripture in here. So let me give you another scripture here. Because Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2. And he wrote to Timothy and saying this. He said, the things which you've heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will then be able to teach others also. 4 generations there in that passage. Paul, Timothy, faithful men, others. Right? What you have heard from me, Timothy, pass on to faithful men who will entrust it to others. How many generations have this church been in existence? About 4, right? Those 41 men and women passed on, just like Paul did, to their Timothys, to their faithful men and women, and now to us. And it's our task to continue on this. I mean, we're not done here. We need another 4 generations, and another, if the Lord tarries, after that. It reminds me of another teaching, another passage of Scripture from Psalm chapter 78, which says this. It says, we will not hide them, these truths about God, from our children. We will tell them to the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, His powers, and the wonders He has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law of Israel, which He commanded our forefathers to teach their children, so the next generation will know them, even the children yet to be born, that they would turn and tell their children, 5 generations there. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget His deeds, but keep His commands. Right? Even the Old Testament says, hey, pass these on to the next generation. Who's going to pass them on to the next generation? Who's going to pass them on? We're in that process. We're supposed to pass them on to this next generation, to these next boys and girls that you saw up here this morning. And as I thought about this message and all the men and women who have been spread this message far and wide, like I said, there's a number that stand out. But there was a number that I could not find a whole lot in. Not a lot about. If you look at that list one more time, there's just as many who lived their humble lives very quietly. Didn't make a big splash, it seems. But they raised your children, going about their daily task. They will not have sermons written about them. They will not be put up on a screen, other than maybe in a big list like I did. But they will be singled out as someone who made a big impact, but they were faithful. Every one of them, I can almost guarantee, was faithful to God. And their faithfulness made an impact on someone's life somewhere along the way. And they made a splash in this little pond, and their ripples are still going out. Then I read this last Sunday in our Daily Bread. You guys read Daily Bread? You guys read this last week? You guys read the one that from last Sunday? Oh, I loved it. Let me read it to you this morning. The title is Lower Deck People. It says, a friend of mine works on a hospital ship called Africa Mercy, which offers free health care to developing countries. The staff daily serve hundreds of patients whose ailments would otherwise go untreated. One of those mercy ships type of thing you see on TV. TV crews who periodically board the ships point their cameras on its amazing medical staff who fix cleft palates, reset club feet. Sometimes they go below deck to interview other crew members. But the work Mick does often goes unnoticed. Mick is an engineer and admits being surprised about where he'd been assigned to work. He's assigned to work in the ship's sewage treatment plant. With up to 40,000 liters of waste produced each day, managing this toxic material is serious business. Without Mick tending the pipes and the pumps, Africa's life-giving operations above deck would stop. It's easy to applaud those who are on the top deck of Christian ministries while overlooking those who are below in the galley. When the Corinthian church elevated those extraordinary gifts above others, Paul reminded them that every believer is important and has a role in Christ's work. And that every gift is important, whether that's miraculous healing or simply helping each other out. In fact, the less prominent role, he says there in 1 Corinthians, often deserves greater honor. Are you a lower deck person at ask? Then lift your head high, because God can use you and your faithfulness as well. While I did highlight some people from the upper deck, I'm sure those in GFC, that many were touched by those who were in the lower decks, those who were in the regular pews like you guys. These 41 members made an impact upon their lives and our lives. Now, I went over a little bit, so I'm not going to do the closing hymn this morning, but I am going to close with a song. Down when I was in the Shift conference down in Florida here a couple of weeks ago, they had a singing group, an a cappella group. They sang all without music or without instruments, all the sounds that they make. Even the drum sets are all vocalized. A very great group. Had their start at Bethel University, another great university in the missionary church. They had a concert down there, and the group is known as Luminos. And among their many songs, there's this one that I really love. It's one of my favorites. And so I'm going to conclude the message with this, because it kind of sets the idea perfectly. And I'm going to walk to the back because I don't want you to see me cry, because it's one of those songs that makes me cry almost every time. But it talks about how those who come behind us, those men and women, boys and girls who come behind us, may they find us faithful. And may they sense God working in their lives through us. So listen to the song by Luminos, Find Us Faithful.
We're pilgrims on the journey of a narrow road, and those who've gone before us line the way. Oh, cheering on the faithful, encouraging the weary, their lives are stirring testament to God's sustaining grace. Surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us run the race not only for the prize, but as those who've gone before us, let us leave to those behind us the heritage of faithfulness passed on through godly lives. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. May the fire of our devotion light their way. May the footprints that we lead them to believe, and the life we live inspire them to obey. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. After all our hopes and dreams have come and gone, and our children sift through all we've left behind, may the clues that they discover and the memories they uncover become the light that leads them to